Chapter 6. After the rain, a stretch of uneventful days followed. Autumn arrived. It got much colder. Then one day, Coronado held a meeting with his captains, and all agreed that the village of Tiji would be the ideal place for the army to rest for the winter. It turned out to be a unanimous decision, and on the following Sunday, the entire army assembled and circled back west. According to the guides, the province Tiji had enough food and shelter to supply the army for quite some time. When the Turk was asked if he knew of such a place, he said he did. It was a peaceful, humble place, he said. It was only 20 miles away, and furthermore, it was a place which hardly snowed. In a 2 days' journey, the Spanish discovered many streams and river flows that came across rocky slopes and bends. And the following day, they found the province of Tiji, which was a very large settlement of several connected tribes that stretched across 4 miles. Another mountain was seen in the distance, and as the Spanish approached Tiji, drips of snow fell from sunny skies. The land beyond was mud and ice. The air was still warm and dry, and at night the air dipped. 90 days seemed to be the limit. 90 days of rest and recovery. But while at rest, the Spanish primed their focus on Quivira, the thought, and the dream. When we arrived at Tiji, it snowed the entire day. The storm started with a sprawl of fierce winds at dawn and came from the base of the adjacent mountain, and in the afternoon, a constant and drifting snow poured down upon us. Tiji itself and the surrounding provinces were what the Turks said they were. There were 12 pueblos in all, and they aligned on the banks of the river. When I saw it, I felt momentarily at ease. A river meant there was enough food and water. Little did anyone in our unit assume or foresee that the river would soon freeze over, but it did. And as we talked to the pueblo servants, most of them had confirmed that at times the river was so hard that a man could walk on it. As we paced through the snow, we stopped and ushered our horses into a large makeshift stable. It was a homely, respectful village with much culture and decorum. The Tiji people seemed old and tragic. Their faces were brown and gray, and their eyes seemed hard and damaged. In comparison with the Corazons, the Tijis were much shorter, and their bodies were lean and hunched over. We found out that all villages were governed by a council of elder tribesmen, but the curious and alarming fact for me was that these people never once smiled. I assumed that it was unaccustomed for them to do so. Their countenance remained stern, and they resembled the canyons below, strong and beautiful, but ultimately isolated and unconcerned. So the winter began. I was never so cold in my entire life. There were no reprieves, no respites. Each day slid and the dying sunlight waned, and the brisk winds intensified and swirled back from west to east. And for weeks at a time, the chill of the air slowly crept into our souls and lingered. Day by day, I watched the Pueblo people stack bricks. Each house was 4 stories high. Each villager looked extremely focused at work and showed little to no expression. Work delineated between the sexes, and it seemed that every villager, disregarded of age, had labored and erected the new houses. As days passed, I watched them make bricks and studied their process. It was a long and tedious process, but they seemed not to mind. The women mixed the plaster and erected the walls, while the men took to the trees and came back each day with thick timbers. I was curious to find out they had no lime, but they did have mud, and they made their mortar by mixing it with charcoal ash. Each house was uniquely designed, but the layout of each house was very familiar. And inside all the houses, we found floors paved with large, smooth slabs of animal skins. The cold felt worse at night. Many nights I felt a terribly empty feeling that I could not put into words. The men warmed themselves among the fire. They certainly needed rest. I had never seen men so tired in my entire life. Their eyes were dim and seemed as if they would fall off if given a chance. And so what could we do but sleep and dream again and forget our pain? It seemed it was the only thing we could do. One night, I went to Coronado's tent. When I got there, I was surprised that it was empty. I gathered that he was either at some other man's tent or alone somewhere, walking in his unusually strange and unnatural state. I overlooked his stationery and read his notes. The parchments weren't addressed to anyone, and Coronado's penmanship looked jagged and jumbled and strained. I tried for several minutes to discern, to gauge, and to draw feeble conclusions. It looked as though it were a puzzle only a madman could solve, and I couldn't read a word. I noticed, too, that his pen was dulled to a thin point. If my father had seen him in this light, he would have no doubt cursed Coronado to hell, calling him an educated fool. I'll admit that I had those thoughts myself. Learned men who shut off the world never get the respect that they think they deserve. And clearly, Coronado was one of them. But I also knew, deep down, no other man in his right mind would have led us this far. He was mad, yes. Yet more importantly, he was aware of the fact. And when I saw him approach the tent, I merely shook his hand. As the days in Tiji progressed, word spread of giant beasts that roamed north. The Pueblo men called these beasts buffalo, and confirmed that they hunted them throughout the autumn and winter. They described these buffaloes as large as bulls, with piles of fur that covered their entire faces and hindquarters. Later, the elder tribesmen of the Pueblo met Coronado. They talked for a while, and after the decision, Coronado deemed it necessary that we do some of our own hunting. So we did. For 2 days, we roamed east into the wilderness. Ice had formed overnight and stayed throughout the morning. On the 3rd day, we found the remnants of dung. Then we found a tiny stream that cut in between the grass. And on the 4th day, we found the stream, and it was there that we had found the buffalo. At first, we only found 3 of them. They were full and thick, and their horns were small and sharp. We watched them sink their faces and slurp the water in large gushes, and we heard them snarl loudly. It wasn't until I saw the beast up close that I knew just how large they were. They were enormous. They were 3 times the size of a horse. We spent the entire morning scouting the beast, trying to find the main herd, and I ordered the men not to fire a single shot until we found more. Then around noon, Julio shouted and pointed to a slope at the far end of the plains. As we came to the spot, we looked down and found the herd. I lost count of how many came across my sight. There must have been 1,000 of them. We studied their movements. They trampled and galloped and rushed, and they were unlike any beast we had ever seen. Their hooves stomped and shook the ground, and the vibration rattled us. We watched them spur and dance along the plains. Their movements were smooth and pure. They rumbled and stammered and collided, but they did so with grace and with little effort. And they conquered the grounds below, smashing the cold plains and the dying yellow grass. Although the collected herd was grand, they were not all uniform. Some buffalo were brown, others black, and the rarest of rare buffalo were white. But I only counted a half dozen of them. To us, the herd was God's great gift. It was food for the winter and even beyond. For the natives, however, the buffalo was God itself. It started to rain, and in the cold, windy afternoon we hunted. We took out our hand cannons and crossbows and shot away, and the mighty beasts fell and plummeted to the ground. It was the easiest hunt God had ever made. We shot as many as we could. In all, 30 buffalo lay dead on the ground. They fell in claps and roars of crashing thunder, while the rest of the herd vanished down the plains. The wounded buffalo ran until their hearts gave out, and the groans of the beasts echoed until we stabbed every last one of them. We waited an hour for the caravans to arrive. Since it was dusk, I decided that we would wait until morning to head back to camp. The rain stopped, and as the sun returned, the birds above swirled and stalked and dipped over us. And as the caravans arrived, we carried the carcasses one by one. It took 10 men to do so. By the time we finished loading the caravans, the sun had waned and was replaced with passing billows of dark clouds. We made our fires, and the men celebrated and drank many bottles of wine and dined on the meat. I ate my share and drank a bottle, and I fell quickly into slumber. Throughout the night, I heard the men laugh. I might have been dreaming. I might have not. But what I remember the most that night was seeing the eye of the last buffalo I had shot. Its white and fiery eyes festered into my dreams, and its dying groan rippled like the waves of the ocean. But once I opened my eyes and saw the beast dead, I felt relieved. I said a prayer and went back to sleep. And in the darkness, I took great comfort. The morning came and we headed back to camp. Throughout our trip, I feared the weight of the caravans wouldn't hold, but by some miracle, they did. When we arrived at camp, the men did not cheer. Rather, they stood astonished and silent. They stared at the carcasses with blank expressions. The Pueblo people, however, gasped and stood in absolute horror. What would take them months to obtain, we had completed in one afternoon. As we reached the gorge, one of the wagons gave way and collapsed. The carcasses slumped down to the ground and had formed into a gigantic pile. I ordered the men to divide each carcass by unit, and as the men rushed over, they picked up the carcasses, grabbed their machetes, and got to work. I ordered the Diaz brothers to be the main butchers, and I watched them with the same appreciation I always did. They estimated that the entire lot of meat would take a week to dress and prepare. They worked fast and put in long and hard hours. First, they took out the hides and cut the thick outside skin. Then they cut off their heads and let the blood drain down to the sand. And finally, they took the carcasses, split them in half, and hung them upon bent wooden poles. And so, one by one, they made their primal cuts. Necks and shoulders, backs and legs, chucks and ribs, plates and flanks, and loins and rounds. At rest, they sharpened their knives, and with each passing night, the Diaz brothers thought of the long day ahead of them, and their individual quotas. They knew they had to work fast, and that the meat would quickly spoil, so they approached a vacant stone pueblo and filled it with packs of ice and leftover snow. And as the piles and piles of butchered meat packed up, it became harder and harder to find storage. But in due earnest, they saved everything. The intestines and organs were issued as primary gifts to the villagers, and the tongues and hearts were given especially to the elder statesmen and chieftains of Tiji. After several days, the whole village stank of blood and chilies, and the smell lingered on for as long as I could remember. But still, with their sharp knives and saws, the Diaz brothers cut into the beast, and as the blood poured down, it stained the sands and had formed its own reservoir, which seemed to get deeper and deeper every day. After another 3 days, the Diaz brothers had finally finished. There was enough meat, seemingly, for 2 winters. The hides of the buffalo, too, were auctioned off to the highest bidder. What was left over was relegated to the remaining men, though in much smaller garments. And by a week, almost every man in the village wore heavy, warm buffalo skin, which they draped along their shoulders. Sometimes I saw the men take slabs of raw meat and chew throughout the whole day. And being that many had no teeth at all, they simply swallowed the meat and gorged it down their throats. Yet, when I had cleared, they always retained a satisfying nod and smile. Salt stood at a premium. I couldn't even afford a pinch, so I chewed slowly. At first, the meat held an awful rancid taste, but I conceded each meal as a blessing, and as I swallowed the meat, I fell into bliss and almost felt alive. I felt my blood revive itself as it digested the new, strong, and forceful blood of the beast, and the feeling lasted well into the afternoon and night. While at meals, the villagers gathered and dined periodically with us. The villagers prayed, and we prayed as well, but they prayed longer. Many times, neither party shared a word. Words were replaced by moans and belches, and there was a consensus amongst both sides that words can only damage, coherent or not. And as the nights went on, I looked at the Turk and watched him as he studied us. He watched us feast and lick the blood from our hands as we tried to rectify all we had lost and what the desert had taken from us. He watched us relish. He watched us slobber and swallow. He watched us chew and slurp. But the Turk neither flinched nor stammered. He merely watched. November came to Tiji, and the cold and the rain came upon the land. Around 50 more buffalo were slain and butchered, and as Tovar's men arrived, news had broke. Among the guides they found east was an odd-looking Indian who claimed to be from the Pawnee tribe. They called the man Whiskers because his facial hair was thick and looped from either end. He was of stocky build, and his face was filled with scars. Brother Luis and the interpreter spoke to Whiskers, and quickly the ensuing scribes gathered all the information and relayed it to Coronado. When Coronado arrived, he asked Whiskers again and again about the cities of gold, but unlike the Turk, Whiskers carried neither gold nor silver. He neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. However, he did mention the province he came from, and said there was enough food there to supply the entire army for several months. He went on and said that the Spanish were welcome to stay there for the upcoming winter, provided they agreed to trade goods with the tribe. Coronado agreed to the terms, and traded quilts and leftover wood in exchange for corn and dried beans. After the exchange, Whiskers seemed content with the initial transaction, but the Spanish were not. Each day, Coronado and many others continued to ask Whiskers if there was any gold in this land, and each day Whiskers shook his head, stating that he did not know what Coronado was talking about. But as the days passed, so did scrutiny. Many in the camp simply distrusted Whiskers. They gave him skeptical, disdainful, and sometimes preposterous stares. These men were not philosophers. They were ordinary, unsatisfied men with rational grievances, and their questions remain unanswered. The Turk, however, remained the great shining light he had been since the Spanish first met him. For long periods, the Turk stared at Whiskers. It was evident that the two had known each other before. Where or why, the men could only speculate. Sometimes the Indians merely whispered at each other. Other times they shouted and barked at each other like dogs. The Spanish laughed at this, and some said the reason they did this was to prove who was the worthier slave. As days wore on, more rumors simmered, and as nights fell, the men elaborated upon their questions and their fears. And again, they tried to rationalize and speculate just exactly who these natives were and what they were hiding. They went on and muttered their thoughts aloud in the icy air. This Whiskers, I don't trust him. Why? I just don't. Look at his face. I've heard that this Turk was a slave of Whiskers, and that he had escaped some time ago. I've heard just the opposite. I've heard that Whiskers is the slave of the Turk. Then which one is true? They're both bastards. That I can agree with. Well, you didn't hear what I heard. Pray tell, what did you hear, you little shit? I heard they both knew Esteban. Esteban? Yes. Who the hell is Esteban? Don't you remember? Esteban was the Moor who was with Marcos. He was? He was also with Cabeza de Vaca. What the hell does that have to do with anything? If these natives knew of Esteban, they must know of the cities. In other words, we finally found the right guides. I can't follow your logic at all. I can't either. So these natives knew them more. What does that mean? It means that we're on the right path, that we are not as lost as you think we are. You assume a lot, my friend. At least the Turk brought something. This Whiskers is useless. I'm still wondering where the Turk got that treasure from. The Turk knows everything. It seems that way. He'll show us these cities. We'll own these cities. Every last one of them. This hell has got to end someday. I have faith in the Turk. Don't have too much. And as the men readied themselves for sleep, they bade each monk and priest a good night. And out in the darkness, Luis remained alone. During the night, Luis recited his rosary. His hands turned blue and numb. He thought of his mother and prayed for her soul. Then he prayed to the Virgin Mary for guidance and comfort. He heard the other priests by the trees. They sparked lanterns of incense and blessed small twigs and ragged dry leaves. Then they sang hymns in the harsh wind. One priest read out loud from the book of Daniel, and the monks sounded off in accord. And soon, Luis gave in and joined the bellows of harmony. And with his trembling hand, Luis took out a bell and a hard branch and struck out uneven chimes. The night went on. Luis prayed and meditated. The prairie winds howled, and again, Luis drifted into dream. Many images and voices sauntered in his mind. The images were of mountains and deserts and islands he once knew. And there, in heaven, was Christ with his mother. But then the images swirled and broke into pieces. Voices shouted from the sky. The voices of Marcos and other priests he knew. Some spoke in prayer, others shouted and cursed. And the bells of San Juan Bautista rung on. And the king Nebuchadnezzar, who hailed from Babylon, presented the golden image. Then the truth rose to the surface. The reason why he was here. The day repeated, every moment in detail. That day in the desert, where time had stopped. The day Luis had seen the devil. The day Marcos lost his mind. The horror. And the city Luis never saw. And Marcos cried again. There they are, Luis. Esteban was right. The city's Luis. Don't you see? Salve Regina, mater misericordiae. Esteban! Esteban! But there were those who did not worship the golden image. Certain Jews among them. Your whole life is a lie. Your whole life is a lie. Your whole life is a lie. Vita dulciro, et spes nostra salve. My God, they're beautiful, Luis. We're here, Luis! They gathered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and a fiery furnace awaited them. Vita dulcedo, et spes nostro salve. It's a lie you've believed in for 20 years! No, no, Luis screamed. Damn you! Damn you all to hell! He awoke. His face was filled with tears, and he knew someone was watching him. He heard sounds of laughter, seemingly from above. He turned around. He turned side to side. And there, 5 feet in the distance, stood the Turk. They stared at each other, and once again, Luis fell into the Turk's gaze, deep and beyond, deeper still. But when the trance was over, nothing was left. No angels, no spirits, no lights transcending. There was only the moment, and the darkness. And as Luis screamed, the Turk laughed again. An unexpected hot and dry morning arrived. The air sank dense and humid, and all throughout the afternoon, I searched for my horse. I crossed over to the edge of the stables, thinking perhaps someone had laced its reins by mistake, but it wasn't there. I asked the stable boys if they had seen the horse. All of them shrugged. They seemed honest enough, and generally concerned. Then a drunk man staggered towards me. Are you Captain Sardina? The man said. I am. I'm afraid I found your horse. I followed the man for about 10 minutes, and there, not far from the stream, I found it. It lay on the sand, and rocks and flies had already formed over its tail and hide quarters. It must have died while I was asleep. We found them this morning, said the man. Captain Tovar said for me to tell you. The man left. I stayed quiet and still for a long while. I stared at the carcass. Its face was mauled and covered with sand. It bled from its teeth. The blood dried and stank. Its nostrils were cold and brittle. Its back was soft, and its hind legs were hardened and thin, and its whole body was covered in crusted mud. I knew it would happen soon, but I was still shocked. In those seconds, I was hopeful that by some miracle that I could resuscitate it. I listened for a sound. I listened for a swallow, breath, or a snarl. One damn sound would have been enough. But there was nothing, and my miracle had been denied. Then another man approached me from behind. It was Tovar. He stared at the horse, then let out a sigh. Then he rolled his eyes. Don't cry over dead horses, Sardina, he said. I didn't respond. It's a good thing there's food in this land. If there wasn't, we'd have it for dinner. He was right, and I forwarded no objections. About 2 days had passed. I stayed close to the wagons, and the raw smell of hides hovered over the camp. Then one morning, another troop of hunters returned to the pueblo with caravans filled with buffalo, and again the men cheered and gawked. In all, there were 7 caravans, and all of them were filled to the brim with buffalo. They must have slaughtered 100 of them. I scouted the wilderness south. I knew I could no longer endure it, so I went back to the pueblo and headed to the stable to see if I could afford a mule. A man named Garcia was the stable manager in charge of trades and exchanges. By the look of him, he looked like a son of a bitch who would overcharge me, and after a few exchanges and quips, my assumptions were proven correct. His inventory was terrible. 2 of his prized possessions were a pair of black Arabians, and both were outrageously expensive. The rest of the lot were mules, tired and pathetic fillies, and a couple 2-year-old munchinos that looked ancient in pain. Minutes passed, and I looked all over, but nothing had changed. "Have you any others?" I said. "No, I have not," said Garcia. "Why do all these horses look weak?" "Weak? These are the strongest horses of all Spain. How dare you insult me?" "They look weak." Of course, I was being facetious. They looked beyond weak. They looked half dead, and I knew most of them wouldn't last 2 weeks in the desert. "What about the fillies?" "The fillies are not for sale." "Why?" "They're not for sale." I looked for better options. There simply weren't any. "What happened to Bernardo's horse?" I said. "I sold it," said Garcia. "To who?" "That's none of your business." "Then what do you have?" "I only have mules." "Mules?" "Yes, mules. Are you deaf?" "Show me them." I looked at the mules. Their mouths were cleft. Their eyes looked gray and tired. They yacked and bustled and smelled awful. "How much for the mules?" 420. 420? That's absurd. For that price, I could buy 2 black stallions. That's my price. You're out of your mind. I'd rather ride a pig. Pigs are 100. You're selling shit. These mules are going to die in 2 months. You know that. These are quality mules. I will not compromise. I will not bargain. You're ridiculous. I don't care. My price is my price. You want a mule? You pay my price. No bargains. How about this mule? That one? Yes. How much? That mule's worth your life. I'll give you 300. 300? You've insulted me enough today. 350. That mule's worth at least 400, and that's my final price. I gave him a grimace and darted my eyes. Then I went into my chest and paid him what he wanted. I looked into the chest. There was 1 piece of silver left. He went over to the mule and handed me the reins. "You've got one hell of a bargain on this one," he said. "Never mind. It's mine now. Who was its last owner?" He didn't reply. His eyes drifted to the stallions. "The owner, you idiot! Who owned it last?" "That bastard Marcos." "This was his ass?" "Now it's yours." I took the mule and rode it for a good 2 hours. I rode until sundown and went about 3 miles. I felt inferior in every way. I felt the most pity for the mule. It had to bear not only Marcos but myself. I should have died when I had the chance, back before the canyons. But the mule was still there, as was I. We had to suffer just a little more. Later that day, I was greeted by Tovar. He took one look at the mule and gave out a laugh. "Don't be ashamed, Sardina. Jesus himself rode to Jerusalem on an ass. But then again, you don't look like the anointed type." I laughed, only because I couldn't do anything else. Then I followed Tovar back to camp, and he invited me over to his fire. We shared a meal and a bottle of wine, and we talked over the dark and moonless sky. How far are we from the others? Far enough. Do you think they'll catch up by next week? God willing, if we're lucky. And as Tovar took out another bottle of wine, he reached over and uncovered a square chessboard. Know how to play? I rolled my eyes. Yes. Yes, I'm afraid I do. Thank God for small miracles. We set up the board and commenced. At the very start of the game, I noticed that Tovar favored the rook and the bishop very much. And likewise, I countered with knights and an abundance of pawns. Although Tovar was not as clever as Soto, he knew all the strategies. It was one of the longest games I ever remembered playing. I lost count of how many moves we had made, but it was well beyond 4 dozen, and we played to the bitter end. During the midpoint, Tovar sighed and broke the silence. You're quite skilled, Sardina. I have to say I'm impressed. I've been playing for a long time, I said. I can tell, he said. We exchanged pieces. I looked at the board. I had 9 pieces. Tovar had 8. Well, someone has to win, I said. Someone has to lose, too, said Tovar. But, as it were, neither was the case. A painful hour elapsed. All that remained were our 2 kings, and the game ended in a stalemate. We scowled at each other, and shrugged our shoulders. Then we set the board aside and talked about other things. Then I grew bored, and bid Tovar good night. I headed to Coronado's tent and saw him hunched over in his blankets. He was still writing. We talked. I tried to feed him golden lies, but I was simply running out of them. With each lie, I felt as if I were bleeding from an open sore. Later, we heard the yips of coyotes and the howls of the winter wolves. Then he turned to me and tried to smile. Beautiful beasts, aren't they? He said. Yes, they are, I said. You have any other stories to tell, Sardina? No, not at the moment. We talked about things we had lost and things that we could not return to. We talked about things that we could not redeem and things we'd never find again. His words were pained and incredibly odd. So were mine. Then we talked about Marcos. Do you think he's dead already? Coronado asked. He might be, I said. I think he is, Coronado said. It would be better if he were dead. I could have killed Marcos right then and there, Sardina. I wanted to. Cardenas was right. We were following a fool. Priest or not, it was a goddamn fool. But I couldn't, Sardina. Something in me couldn't kill him. I still don't know why. He paused and turned. And now we have this Turk. This El Turco. He is the devil, isn't he? There was nothing humorous about his face when he asked the question. His face grew sadder. He waited for my response. The desert or the jungle, Sardina, he said. Which hell do you prefer? They seem the same at times, I said. Did it feel like this, though? Feel like what? Did it feel this empty? I didn't answer him. I didn't know how. After another minute, Coronado stepped away and wished me a good evening. I walked another round through the pueblo until my legs had ached. Then I rested near one of the fires. Somehow I couldn't sleep. I got up and looked at the moon, and across the fire, I saw Brother Luis sitting by his lonesome. I didn't want to bother him, but something in Luis's eyes compelled me over, and I sat beside him. Something in me knew that he really believed in Christ. He told me strange thoughts he had had. He said that his life had resembled the Gospels, and that through his life he had played all the roles. He played the disciple, the brother, the father, the doubter, the crucifier, and the crucified. Maybe these things were fabrications, But I sat next to him because, in reality, I knew we both needed the company. "I cannot hear confession, Sardina," said Luis. "I'm only a monk." "I'm not here for confession, brother." "Then why are you here?" "I don't know," I said. I tried to think of better words, but I couldn't afford any. "I don't know." And it wasn't until then that I understood how true those words really were. More time had passed. The air dipped, and morning after morning, a thick thatch of frost had covered the entire pueblo. Though the Turk constantly said there was no gold in Tiji, it did not prevent the Spanish from searching. At all times, the Spanish searched through the pueblo for any speck of silver. Led by Whiskers, the Spanish went north and east. 2 days later, they found a gorge 10 miles from the pueblo. Deep within the gorge, they had found a plentiful quarry of rocks, walls of hard, jagged stones, and a path of crumbled clay pots and fire pits that seemed to have no end. Whiskers said that this was a burial of his ancestors. He repeated endlessly that there was no gold there, nor silver or jewels. There were merely bones and ashes. Yet none of the Spanish believed a word. None at the time knew what the quarry was, yet for the moment, it awoke the spirits of all the men. It was strange and somewhat holy, but what it represented was much more. It represented a hope and a new obsession. And the Spanish took to the quarry and searched every inch. From the moment we found the quarry, I was skeptical. I repeatedly told the men that they were wasting their time. But blind young men never listen. So I watched them take to their axes and dig, day after day. I saw them give in to that familiar trance, and I heard them thinking aloud to themselves, spilling and reaching for their impossible dreams. Julio remained the most excited. "There's something about this place," he said. "I know it. I know it." "Are you sure, Julio?" I said to him. "Sure, I'm sure," he said. "I haven't been this certain all my life." But Julio was not alone. More men came to realizations, and I merely listened to their ramblings and pent-up desires, trying not to intervene. "This whole place might have been a city. A buried city. We have to dig, that's all. If we dig hard enough, by a week we'll find it." "You sure?" "Sure. Just think of it. There's 7 cities. This could be one of them. Just 1 week. We'll find something. There's bound to be something." "But did Marcos? Did the Turk? What about them? Did they see? Did they reach here?" "It doesn't matter. Look at the rock. Tell me there's nothing there." "I'm convinced. Aren't you?" "It's worth a try." Then they turned to me. "What do you think, Captain Sardina?" I neither agreed nor attempted to understand. In my younger days, I could follow such logic, but I granted them what they wanted. I gave them 1 week to search. No more, no less. And for the duration of our stay in the quarry, I decided only to be their captain. And I sighed and watched them dig and thrust their axes in the fallen snow. They took to their shovels and pickaxes, and they worked in a fury. They shouted in excitement and curses. They continued to pick and dig with demented, dirty faces. And I listened to the pings of metal clash against the hard, hanging gray rocks as their steel clanked off in sparks. On the 2nd day, Tovar's men had joined us. And by the 3rd day, nearly all the men of the pueblo, including Coronado himself, had gathered to the quarry. Then, suddenly, several men reported back that they had found something glitter in the flurries. Hours later, those rumors turned true. They drilled deeper and found shiny rocks and carried them to the surface. The whole army gathered to see what it was, and a crowd of wild and red faces screamed. But to their dismay, the rocks were only specks of iron pyrite that were near worthless in value. By the next day, most of our patience was all but gone, for it was tragically the same as the last. Cold and damp and wasted. No gold, No silver, no rubies, nor emeralds. And as the week passed, the excitement elapsed into utter futility. And finally, I ordered my men to cease and desist their efforts. The sun died to another night. We made another fire. I studied the men's angry, dejected faces as the dogs whimpered and lay by their side. I heard them shiver as they blew warm air into their fists, and all throughout the night, I watched them all become old men. In the morning, I saw Julio from afar. I knew something was wrong with him, and the more I looked at him, the more concerned I became. His eyes were filled with rage. He isolated himself from the others, and he babbled, swinging his sword to and fro. Later, I heard him curse and swear at the Pueblo people, and time after time I saw him chase them, threatening to kill every last one of them. By this time, I had enough of his antics. I approached him and slapped him across the face and forbade him to do such things ever again. But I knew my warnings and words went unheard. An hour later, I tended to my mule. I talked to the Diaz brothers for a while, then I went to see Brother Luis. Afterward, I caught up with Tovar. Then, I heard a scream. I heard footsteps and more screaming. From the edge of the Pueblo, I saw Julio wearing a thick wool coat, and below him was a decapitated Pueblo man with blood gushing out from his open neck. When I saw him, Julio stared at me and smiled. He grabbed the head with one hand and his bloody sword in the other. Then he marched back to the Pueblo and screamed, threatening each Pueblo man he came across. I ordered the Diaz brothers to tackle him to the ground, which they did without hesitation. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. And I knew from that instance, the days of peace in the Pueblo were over. The Indians of the Pueblo took their revenge immediately. Early the next morning, the Spanish found 10 of their horses dead on the ground. They were stabbed by wooden spears. Later, the Spanish found a dozen more of their livestock, dead and wounded. They searched for the perpetrators. However, there were no Indians in sight. There were only lines of cornmeal spread through each entrance of the houses. The Indians guarded themselves, huddling over the doors with pointed arrows and spears. And they waited for the inevitable duel with the devils they had invited. At noon, a Spanish scout had been clubbed in the head with a rock, and soon a yell echoed through each of the houses. The Spanish received word and put on their armor. They waited on the outskirts of the Pueblo. Then the signal was given, and as the Spanish marched back to the houses, the war in the Pueblo began. Coronado shouted out his orders. We were to smoke them out from under. The men lit torch after torch, and the smoke rose and rolled in huge black plumes, and soon the Pueblo people rushed out, choking and sprinting for air. By the end of the day, all but a few of the Indians had abandoned their houses. We watched them flee into the night. Some men had followed them. I was one of them. I followed Cardenas and his men down a bevy of slope and undulating rocks that led down an orange canyon. For a straight hour, we searched through the rocks and underpins. We searched again under the stones and passages. And we searched through the shadows and bright sunshine. We returned without seeing them. They left no clue. They're here. We'll just have to wait, said Cardenas. Give them time. They'll come back to the surface. Another hour passed. Half of the men searched again. Half of the men waited. Then a dozen of Cardenas's men returned from their search below. We looked all over, sir, said one of the men. They must have died. You didn't go deep enough, said Cardenas. Remember, I want them alive. Looks like we'll have to wait until sundown. We rested and waited and stared until the purple light of dusk arrived. Soon slivers of pale yellow sunlight emerged. But then we heard a rustling. A few 100 feet away, we saw 2 Indians run down the hill. Cardenas made a gesture with his hands, and half a dozen men went west. The others went east. I rushed about 100 paces and looked below. Then Cardenas's men tackled the Indians to the ground, and the men roared. We got 'em! We got the bastards! The men chained the 2 Indians. A line had formed, and each man proceeded to slap the Indians across their faces. Some spat in their eyes. My men had done the same. "Captain Sardina, it's your turn," one of my men said. But I refused, and I waved my hand. I stared at the Indians' faces. I saw both of them cry and whimper as they took each blow, and I watched their blood drip down to the stones. Their mouths were smeared with blood, and I watched until I couldn't watch any longer. Another line had formed. The men wanted more. I saw it in their bastard eyes. They wanted nothing other than to slap and choke and smash, but most of all, they wanted to stab. And when I had enough, I shouted at them. "Enough! Enough, you fools!" I took one of Cardenas's men and pushed him to the ground. Then I stared at them all. They looked bewildered. Then I screamed. "Our orders are finished! We are to report back to camp. That is all!" The men stared stupidly. They took the slaves back to camp, but by then it was pointless. Because by then, the slaves were already dead. After days of no action, we were convinced that the people of Tiji had given up. Their whole complex was abandoned, and we had settled into every house and dwelling place. Again, I found it hard to sleep. My hands shook and my head ached, and I felt blood dripping from my ears. Then I heard a scream from one of the slaves. I knew it was an ambush. I got out of the tent and saw the Indians rush out with spears. The Indians jumped and collided into us, thrusting their bodies from up top the tents. I ordered and shouted at my men to surround the perimeter. I knew most of my men were drunk and dazed, but they rushed into action, and they stumbled blindly. But by then, the Indians already retreated. In the morning, I saw Coronado and Cardenas. Neither of them said a word. The other captains gathered. I was the last captain to approach. Coronado screamed so much that he cried. He shouted over and over again, and threw pots and pans and continued to scream. I walked to get a closer look at who he was screaming at, but all I saw was the Turk, who seemed unfazed. "Sardina," said Coronado, "take your men up 2 miles south. Round up and join the others. We need information. Torture if you need to. Torture if you want." I paused. Coronado sighed. Then he jumped back upon his horse and galloped away. And through the Turk's eyes, he saw the horror. For an entire ungodly month, the Spanish waged full and unfettered war with the Pueblo people. They killed at least 24 natives a day. Some days, they killed more. He watched the dogs let loose and on to the Pueblo people. He watched the Spanish bowmen pierce the retreated warriors, and he watched the Spanish soldiers slice and hack off their limbs, just as they did in Cusco. The Turk watched and cringed at the billowing smoke and saw it fill and spread from one end of the province to the other. But most of all, the Turk cringed, because there was nothing he could do. He wanted to defy. He wanted to fight. He wanted to die in valor. But he wanted to die protecting the Pueblo people. But he knew that if he had died, that the purpose of his mission would be wasted. So he watched and cried. At the very start and very end of the day, Coronado made it a point to stare at the Turk and sneer at him for a full minute. He approached the arrested warriors and ordered their instant execution. And for hours on end, Coronado simply walked around the Pueblo with a lit torch and a grimace. And at the end of each day, Coronado took a long look at the day's siege. But somehow, there was not even an ounce of satisfaction on his face. And still, the Pueblos of Tiji burned. All of its history had crumbled to ashes and vanished asunder. And the Spanish burned and burned until the Pueblos were no more. I can't remember how many I stabbed. I can't remember how long it lasted. Some said it was 3 months. Others said it was merely 3 weeks. But what I remember most were the screams. Their screams in hours. the screams of the horses and the cattle, and the screams of the women that to this day I hear in my horrible dreams. The sieges reminded me of the sieges of Cusco. When the sun rose and the light returned, I saw many faces covered in blood. One day I counted 50 dead Indians that lay on the ground. About a quarter of them were women. Many of them we never saw before, but those we did recognize, we knew for certain. Some of them were our servants, even before we left Compostela. We targeted a dwelling place 2 miles from the center. It took us 3 entire days to take it. In that time, much remained the same. We tortured and killed, and the men had their way. And as each day ended, we made a fire and burned the bodies. We watched the smoke build and smolder as skulls and flesh melted and were engulfed in the flames. And we watched the pile burn and burn. I searched for Brother Luis, but I couldn't find him. I imagined him praying. Perhaps he was denying like Peter. Perhaps he was waiting for a cock that would never crow, and clinging to something he thought he understood. But he wasn't alone, because as I watched and watched all these familiar events unfold before my eyes, I did not enjoy any of it. I remained numbed, and my heart was filled with pain. Later, we found and captured the Indian they called Whiskers. We had learned from the translators that he had been leading the rebellion from the very start. Coronado issued his final judgment without reconciliation, and Whiskers' torture had been ordered to last for an entire day. In the morning, they tied him to a pole and lashed him until noon. But by then, he already seemed dead. His face was mauled and mangled, and his entire chest was covered in deep, bloody gashes. They asked him about Quivira and the city's east, and still, Whiskers said he did not know. Then they brought the Turk along to watch, and as Whiskers was untied from the pole, he spat blood onto the Turk's eye. But the Turk remained still and quiet. Coronado then approached both of them, and he gave the signal. The men chained the Turk and carried him away, and the rest of the men tackled Whiskers to the ground, turned him over, and forced a noose around his neck. And a minute later, they garroted him. The day died. The dogs barked at the climbing full moon. And during the night, I found it hard to breathe. The air was cold and still filled with smoke. The fighting ceased. The Pueblo people surrendered. Most were captured and enchained. The head chiefs of the tribes gathered in Coronado's tent, and a surrender was issued the following morning. The terms were agreed upon. Coronado smiled and remained in a confident countenance for the remaining days. He then approached the Turk and unleashed him from his chains. As the sun died, the Turk met with a family of the Pueblos and shared an evening meal with them. He spoke to them in their language. He needed no interpreter. The Turk spoke more and more, and he gave the family his promise. It was a promise that was his alone to keep. The family listened and nodded in agreement. For the Turk revealed to them the truth, that they were still here, they were still alive, and the Turk reminded them of that fact many times. "I can't promise I'll kill all of these devils," he said, "but I can promise that I will drive them all away." Then he held each of their hands and repeated his promise. "I'll drive them away as far as I can." And with that, the Turk made his departure. The family stood and watched the Turk stagger back to the Spanish, and his words circled through their minds. Throughout the night, the family prayed to their gods to assist the Turk in his mission. They prayed long and hard until the rising sun, and when they opened their eyes, they smiled. The next day arrived just like any other. The Pueblo people ate and worked and prayed and slept. And as the sun set again, they looked over and smiled again at the night stars. They knew a new day was soon to come, and they knew the Turk would keep his promise.